Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this webinar about the Cuba tour coming up in January 2019. It is my pleasure to introduce to you one of TourMagination's favorite tour leaders. This is Jack Suderman I have here. He mentioned that he combed his hair special for the occasion, and he is all set to go. And before he tells you more about Cuba, I just want to tell you a little bit about Jack and his wife Irene, who they lead the tour together. Jack and Irene Suderman have been mission workers in Bolivia and Colombia, and they speak Spanish fluently. The Sudermans, along with others from Mennonite Church Canada, have worked with Cuban churches in leadership training for more than 28 years. They've gotten to know and love the Cuban people as they've visited the country many, many times. Jack began as part of a team from Mennonite Church Canada, supported by Mennonite Central Committee. Jack began teaching leadership development to Cuban Christian leaders from a broad spectrum of churches in 1992. Jack has a PhD in Biblical Studies from the Universidad Pontificia Javeriana in Bogota, Colombia, and has worked in teaching and administration in the church for 47 years. Irene has a music degree from Emmanuel Bible College. Irene also worked for many years in palliative care and in spiritual care for seniors in the church. Together, Jack and Irene attend First Mennonite Church in Kitchener, Ontario. They have 3 adult sons, 3 daughters-in-law, and 5 grandchildren. Jack, why don't you take it away and tell us about Cuba?
Well, thank you, and good morning or good afternoon. I'm not sure where people all are. It's good to have this little space of time to tell you a little bit about the tour in January of 2019. That will be a momentous kind of a time for Cuba. Cuba, as you know, is in dramatic transition, or some would say transformation. January will mark the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Revolution, of the triumph of the revolution, January 1st, 1959, when Fidel Castro and his troops marched into Havana without any resistance by that time. So it's 60 years. The revolution, without a question, has been the dominant reality in Cuban life in terms of church and society and business and politics and any other way that you want to look at it for the last 60 years. But it's changing. The revolution so far has outlived 11 US presidents and is into its 12th president since its founding. And so it's been a long and very varied but very interesting history. And so the tour is designed to give us exposure to this very dominant reality in Cuban life, in Cuban society, and specifically focusing also on the experience of the church during these 60 years. And not only historically, but also exposure to the church today. And so there are significant facets that are built into the tour. I'll just mention a few of those facets so that you have a sense of how the tour is shaped and why, what framework we use. There are 5 significant contacts with Cuban church, with the reality of the Cuban church, both present and historically. Those 5 are with the Martin Luther King Center in Havana, the Cuban Council of Churches, where they have a very broad overview of the Cuban life of the Cuban church in the past and now. We visit with the Brethren in Christ congregation on a Sunday morning worship service. We also visit their leadership training center, which is just outside of Cienfuegos. And we visit the Christian Center for Reflection and Dialogue in Cardenas. And so there are a number of very important opportunities for conversation with leaders, kind of iconic leaders of the Cuban church for most of these 60 years. I think there's a map of the route of Cuba on your screen, probably somewhere. And you can see there that we start in Havana. We go west of Havana into the western province for a day. And then we go to the south shore. Havana is on the north shore. We go to the south shore to Cienfuegos. That's also where the Bay of Pigs is. The Bay of Pigs, the famous invasion by the United States, which was repelled by the Cuban forces, and which has become one of the important points of contact, or we should say education, for the Cuban folks. That's also where the Leadership Training Center is. We go to Santa Clara, which you can see just starting to head north again. That's where the historical monument is to Che Guevara, and his tomb is located there. And then we go also to Varadero, which is the premier place for tourism. Spend 2 days on the beach. It's difficult to go to Cuba without going to the beach. And so one of the facets is this part that has to do with the church and connection with the church, conversation with the church. And we will be connecting with some, what I would call iconic leaders, leaders that have just led the church through thick and thin throughout these 60 years. And it's quite a privilege, actually, to still be able to do that. As I said, Cuba is in transition. For the first time in those 60 years now, there is not a Castro that is the president. First, as you know, it was Fidel Castro, and then Raúl Castro took over. Raúl stepped down from the presidency in April of this year. And so they are into a new reality for the first time, they have a president who was not part of the revolution. He is young, he's in his 40s. His name is Miguel Díaz-Canel, and he is bringing a fresh face and a fresh voice to the governing realities in Cuba. The latest news is that he has announced that they will do a complete revision of their constitution of the country. And so change has come for many years already in Cuba. Cuba is not static, it never has been. I like to call it a living experiment. They've experimented with a whole number of things and continue to do so. So it is in transition, it's in transformation, and we want to be exposed to that and try to understand it, understand the challenges that they're facing, and also the challenges that the church is facing within this, or has faced historically and presently. So one of the facets is this question of the reality of the church, and it's we will also be visiting, doing some historical work, historical and cultural orientation. We will see Havana from the windshield of a bus. We will walk the old streets of Havana, the old city, which is quite remarkably restored and rebuilt. Our hotel will be right in the center, very close to the old city center. We'll visit the Museum of the Revolution, where the story can be told more easily about these 60 years. As I said, we'll go to the South Shore. We'll visit the Bay of Pigs, which is a historical site of very great significance in Cuba, and we will be working at telling that story. We will visit Santa Clara, the historical monument and grave site where we can have a chance to tell the story of Che Guevara and his contributions and his work. And of course, for those who are Ernest Hemingway lovers, you may be surprised to know that Ernest Hemingway is a very big hero in Cuba. There's any number of sites that are dedicated to his memory, and we will visit one of them. It's a small, pretty little fishing village on the northern coast, where he wrote The Old Man and the Sea. And so that'll be some of the historical facets of what we, of course, everywhere you look and everywhere you walk and everybody you talk to ends up being part of the history of Cuba, and certainly part of the history of the revolution. So that'll be an important part of this. A third facet is simply what we would call tourism, I guess. Walking the old city, which is remarkable, seeing the tobacco area in the western province of Cuba, watching how they make cigars, which is one of the things that Cuba is very famous for. We'll spend a couple of days, 2 days on the beach in Varadero, which is their premier tourist beach facility. It's very, very beautiful, and we'll have a nice place right there. We'll visit markets and things like that tourists do. And fourthly, we'll get to know each other. It's always a tremendous opportunity to relate to other people, to get to know new friends, to sing together and pray together, and engage in conversation. We will engage in lots of conversation with Cuban leaders and Cuban normal folks in the congregations and elsewhere, but also we can engage in conversation with each other. I should say that Cuba is complex. It's complicated. It's not always easy to understand how their economy works, how their money system works, certainly how their politics work. It's quite a complex story, but it's a fascinating story, and I think for us who are connected to the church, it is a story that is important. I try to always emphasize that it's not only good to go to Cuba at this time of transition, it's very important to go to Cuba. Your or our presence there has meaning for the Cubans that goes way beyond what we can imagine. We don't really understand exactly what the importance all is. And especially, I think, should draw attention here to our US friends, people from US who take the time to go to Cuba. This is especially important because of the stressful and tension-filled and conflictive history that these last 60 years have represented. And so for you to go and visit and talk and become known and engage people at this stage of the Cuban experiment is, I think, very important. It's not only good for you, it's not only that you will learn, you will send a signal that is significantly important to the Cuban people that you will meet. And so, in general, that's an overview of the tour. That's why we go. That's how we go, and it is a very significant time in the history of the Cuban revolution and the Cuban country, and it's a very significant time in the relationship between Cuba and the United States. So I don't know if you have any question, Sharon, or anybody else, or how you would like to continue, but that's kind of
sure.
big.
Thank you, Jack, for starting us off, and I'll start us off with some questions. First of all, I should introduce myself. I forgot to say, my name is Sandra Reimer, and I work with TourMagination on their communication. And I want to let people know how you can communicate questions. So at the bottom of your screen on the left-hand side, there should be a spot for typing in a chat message. If you type in your questions there, I will read them off to Jack, and he will answer them. And that's the way we will handle questions. And I also have some questions of my own. Jack, you began going to Cuba, was it in 1992?
Actually, it's 1986 is when
86
I began.
was the first time. Okay. And why did you first start going to Cuba?
Well, the very first visit was an opportunity when I was asked to be a Mennonite delegate on a delegation of Cuban church a delegation of Canadian church leaders, which was organized and sponsored by the Canadian Council of Churches. And so they were looking for 10 people from various denominations, and I was asked by MCC at the time, Mennonite Central Committee, to be the representative or the delegate for the Mennonite churches. And so that was my first kind of contact, first visit to Cuba. And then we very quickly accelerated because discovered that one of the very key Protestant leaders was passionately, and that's an understatement, passionately interested in what it means to be Anabaptist and what Anabaptism would mean for Cuba and for its country. And so he began really pushing hard for Anabaptist teachers to come and work with the church leaders. And so that accelerated into other opportunities.
Maybe you can, I understand that you and Irene both just have a real passion for the Cuban people. Can you tell me how that expresses itself? Like, how did that develop over the years?
Well, we have, I don't know how often we've been to Cuba. It's probably somewhere like 40 or maybe more, I'm not sure. So we have been, we have crisscrossed Cuba and engaged its society and its churches and in rural areas, in the cities, in small towns, in the churches and other churches for almost 35 years. And so this starts to grow on you. You get to know the people, you get to see their struggles, their challenges that they face, the joy that they have, the concerns that they ask about, and so on. And it's been a very life-giving opportunity for us to walk with the Cuban church and to see their development. I should say, by the way, that the Cuban church is growing since 1992, when the Cuban Constitution was changed, has grown dramatically and continues to grow quite dramatically. And so that has left them with with very significant challenges. One of the main challenges is the question of leadership training, or leaders. Who is going to lead the church that is growing so quickly? And so this question of leadership training has been a very, very key question for them, and that's most of what we have been involved in and continue.
Can you tell me, maybe you can tell us what you think the people from Canadian and U.S. churches can learn from Cubans?
Well, the lessons are never ending. The Cuban, one of the questions that we can, or one of the things that we learn from them is how to deal with division in society and in church. And I should say that the Cuban population, which includes the church, has been divided over these 60 years in terms of the understanding the presence of the revolution and the ideals and the intentions of the revolution. And so it has divided the country, it has divided the church, in many cases it has divided families. And so to see how they have worked with that, how they have overcome, well, no, I shouldn't say they have overcome it. They're still struggling with it, but they have survived that, and they have continued to make very rich contributions to the life of Cuba, is very inspiring. And I think there's a lot we can learn from it, because we also live in a nation or nations that tend to be divided, that tend to be under significant stress and conflict, which also is true in some of our churches. And so that's one of the things I think that really puts us into the same boat in terms of learning from each other. What leadership means, both politically and in the church, what leadership means in that kind of a setting, I think is a significant lesson that we can learn. I think the question of politics, how foreign policy impacts the lives of simple people, either for good or for bad. I think seeing that firsthand and engaging that, I think, is a significant learning that we can have. For example, I don't know how often you will hear about the word embargo and blockade, economic blockade. I don't think there will be a person that you talk to that will not somehow reference that as being and having been a significant part of their development as families, as churches, as society, and continues to be so.
Is that something that you can comment on? I understand that being kind of cut off from other nations that way has forced Cubans to kind of do some innovative things and really rely on themselves. Can you talk a little bit about that? Yeah,
well, I think we have a photo here on the slide presentation of their cars. That's always the one that is most visible. These cars are 1940 and 1950 model cars, and they continue to function normally as taxis, as private vehicles, as family vehicles. And obviously that isn't possible without dramatic innovation, because for them to get parts and replacement parts for these vehicles is not possible most of the time. And so they have been tremendously creative and innovative. That's one example, but there are many other examples of how, in agriculture, for example, how they have developed organic farming. urban gardening. We'll visit one farm run by the Christian Center for Reflection and Dialogue, which is an experimental farm. It's an award-winning farm. They've received top awards in the Cuban system for what they've done agriculturally and with the farmers around that community. In the church, the fact that church buildings and getting land allocated for church buildings has been difficult. So they have learned how to have church without buildings. So they've learned how to do church in homes with neighbors on the backyard under the trees. And it's part of why the church has grown so dramatically. I think there's many lessons there for us. So everywhere you look, every direction you look, there are lessons to be learned. Some positive, some negative, and it continues to be an experiment that is alive. It adapts, it changes, and we are all experiments too. Our nations are experiments, our churches are experiments, even as people. We are experiments, and God doesn't give up on us, and at least not so far. And so we can learn from that.
That's great. Do any of the attendees on the webinar, do you have any questions? Again, you can type your questions in the attendee chat box in the bottom left. If you have questions about anything practical like weather, clothing, things to bring, we do like to let you know that is this the 4th tour, Jack, that you've taken to Cuba, or is it the 5th?
I think it must be the 5th.
Okay. So we have worked out the details of how to have Americans travel to Cuba safely, legally. All of those details are worked out. We have the right permissions to be able to take you on that tour. It helps that we're a Canadian tour company. Jack and Irene are Canadian. And so if you have any questions about that kind of thing, feel free to type them, or weather or anything like that, just let us know.
Yeah, in general, logistically speaking, as you saw on the map, we'll spend some time on the North Shore and some time on the South Shore. The North Shore, by and large, will be a bit cooler. The South Shore will be warmer. And the North Shore, there may be days when a light sweater or a light jacket is comfortable because it cools down, especially at night. The South Shore will be pleasant, pretty well guaranteed all the time. So it's a pleasant, comfortable time. It's not overly hot. It's very pleasant to be there. Money-wise, some folks ask about money. Either US dollars or Canadian dollars are very easily exchanged in the hotels that we'll be staying at. So you just go to the counter of the hotel and you'll get the exchange for your currency, whichever you prefer. So yeah, things like that are well in hand.
Great. Again, if you have any questions, just type them, and we'll be ending the webinar in about 1 or 2 minutes. Jack, is there anything else you'd like to add about why people might want to come with you and Irene on this tour? What they can expect to experience, what they might enjoy?
Well, I started by saying that Cuba is in a time of transition. This has been true, actually, for the last few decades especially. But it continues to be true today, and it seems as if that transition is accelerating, actually. There's it's different, it's new each time. If folks want to get a taste of the Cuba the way it was, it is time to go see it, because even some of that will be changing. They are starting to get things like cell phones and internet and all that kind of stuff. So,
oh, you mean they've been without that mostly?
Yes, there's till the Obama opening in 2014, when Obama opened some options in the U.S.-Cuban relationship. Things were very restricted. Since then, there have been dramatic changes. The cruise ships are starting to land again, and the American airlines are flying, and communication is dramatically changed. So if you want to kind of get a glimpse of Cuba in the way that it has been, it is time to do so, because it is really changing quite dramatically. This is not, of course, more true in the urban centers than in the rural centers. The rural areas will take more time, but there is significant change happening. Also in the market economy, Raul Castro, when he came in 6 years ago as president, he was very open to or encouraging entrepreneurial efforts by Cubans, things like private property and small businesses and distribution of land and all that kind of thing. And so there's a lot of entrepreneurial initiative taking place, which was not there either before he became president. So these are just some of the transitions and changes that are happening. So it's good to go, and also with the 60th anniversary, it'll be very it'll be a historic moment. It'll be to be there, because that'll be a big thing.
Right. Great. Well, thank you so much for telling us about Cuba, Jack, and we will certainly let people know about the tour, continue to let them know and give them opportunity to join you and Irene, like you say, for this historic tour that's going to be right in the middle of the 60th anniversary of the revolution. That'll be an important time to go. And thanks again, everyone who has joined us. We hope you have enjoyed the presentation. Have a good day.
Thank you.